All right, this week I am introducing Rachael Walshe, who is another PhD student with me. She's a social scientist who has told me to say she's braving the world of science.
People.
Science people.
Science people.
Yeah. She is doing a PhD in geography after doing undergrad in environmental management at Uni of Sunshine Coast and getting a Class 1 honours in geography here at JCU. I have to read my things.
That's fine.
So her work is looking at gardening in schools and community gardens and seeing how they can heal the generational environmental amnesia in kids these days. Yeah.
Huh.
I do have more. Sorry, I'm probably more nervous to introduce someone than to present. And just like from a personal note, my work is very top-down and depressing, so it's great to see work that is very positive, bottom-up, has real chance of being useful at solving a lot of environmental problems today. And I really love Rachel's presentations.
Thank you, Jaden.
And you can introduce yourself.
Thanks. I think Jaden did a very great job. Hello, I am Rachael Walshe, as Jaden has mentioned. Before I begin, I usually have a slide for this, but I did forget. But I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, air and sea of where we are today. The three main groups, the Gimoy, Wallabarri, Yidinji, Yuraganji and the Jabberkai up on the range, sort of also touching the campus. Sovereignty was never ceded, and I acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. So, urban school gardens, de-escalating environmental generational amnesia. This is the only presentation I haven't done out of my thesis, so very excited to talk about it today. I'm very excited to devote half an hour to it because I could talk about this for years. Overview, what are we going to discuss today? So what is environmental generational amnesia? I'm going to stand, can I move over here? I'm out of the camera, but cool, I'll just stay here. That's fine. How does it manifest? How do we battle it? I've got battle, but de-escalate is probably a better word for this. Study location and background. I'm going to go over some methods for the science people here, show you some qualitative coding. I'm going to go over confirming EGA's presence in the study site where I work. And then I'm going to go over gardens as learning spaces to de-escalate EGA. And if I have time, I've included some slides at the end to discuss personal reflections I've had working with the school and the children. I run a gardening club there to give back. And I've sort of seen all of these things emerge after collecting my data that I'd really like to be able to reflect on today. So what is environmental generational amnesia? This term was first coined by a scholar called Peter Kahn, who works in the eco-psychology realm in Canada. Basically, environmental managers, you'll probably have heard the shifting baseline syndrome. There's also extinction of experience. This is just another term that is very similar to that, but I choose to use it because I don't think, well, shifting baseline syndrome doesn't really work for food disconnection, in my opinion, in urban areas. Extinction of experience, children still have interactions with food. They still have interactions with ants, mosquitoes on a daily basis, especially here in Cairns. So it's not an extinct experience, but it's a generational amnesia, in my opinion, as what Khan said, because as we move further into this urban realm, we regress further from the natural environment. So we forget what it's like to play in parks outside. Children growing up today won't understand that maybe national parks are supposed to be clean like we had when I was growing up, and then maybe even the generation before. So it's a generational amnesia, a generational forgetting. Just to relate it to Bill's research, like I like to do in presentations to make it more relatable. If you're looking at roads being built in developing countries, 2 generations ago, some people may have not had roads connected to their community. You might have had to get there by boat. I know that's the case in specific areas in Cambodia. Now there's roads that go there. The roads are now being tarred. So while the grandparents remember there was no roads and they remember having to go through the forest and look for different specific foods, the children now only know that food comes in on a truck. Basically, this is a big problem because it results in children forgetting that we are a part of the natural realm. How does it manifest? EGA in children, specifically within developed Western countries in the post-industrial era, it manifests as poor motor skills. So Khan and Weiss did a study in 2017 where they watched people fall over at university campuses and then they went up and they interviewed them afterwards. And they found that the people that ended up with injuries, or significant injuries, were children that hadn't played outside or adults that hadn't played outside as kids. They didn't develop the motor skills to be able to fall and protect themselves. I know as a kid I fell over a lot, and I like to think that I can fall over pretty well as an adult now. But it also goes for like climbing trees, digging in the garden, reading, writing. Motor skills are involved in everything we do, but poor motor skills is linked to environmental generational amnesia. Next, we have limited moral affiliation towards the natural environment. People that haven't experienced things in nature, let's go with huntsmen in Australia, we know that they generally won't harm you. People that haven't experienced that will generally think that a spider is going to hurt you. It won't. So that's a semi-poor example, but it's a disgust. It's a not taking care of it. It's a vandalizing of the environment rather than taking up the role of a caretaker or taking up the role of an environmental steward or someone who cares for it. And then there's place disconnection. So it's children that spend all day, every day indoors and then don't realise because they're in aircon that it's not actually hot outside, it's just 20 degrees. It's children that grow up here in Cairns reading about snow every winter, and because they're inside all the time, they think, oh, why doesn't it snow here? They don't have the understanding that these things happen. And that has happened in my research when I was working with some kids. They were like, we're supposed to get snow in winter. We don't. So, but there's a fundamental disconnect. But I also propose, or we, because my supervisors are co-authors, but I propose that it manifests as limited food origin awareness. Few scholars have tried to link it to it, but they haven't really delved into it. So that's sort of what I'm going to do with this presentation today and the rest of my thesis. Before I go on, how do we combat it? Big nature, getting out in nature, learning how to interact with the world, falling over, engaging with like more than human species for the social scientists, or just bugs and animals and insects. And then interaction patterns. So interaction patterns is defined by Kahn as well. It's a constant and consistent redoing of things in nature. So it is picking an apple from a tree. It is falling over. It is digging in the dirt. It's going for a swim in a clean ocean. It's relating your physical life and body to the natural world and realizing that we're sort of a part of it, not separate from it. So it's in terms of climbing a tree, children learn to, when they start climbing, they're like, oh, I know how to do this. I've climbed a tree before. So I'll use the theory of interaction patterns to show you how gardening works to improve food connection. Also, food disconnection is a form of environmental amnesia. Children see food in grocery stores. They don't see food growing in farms. They don't generally know where it comes from. Jamie Oliver was the first person to point out that children knew potatoes as chips and not potatoes. They knew tomato on a burger, but they couldn't identify the tomato as a tomato. We have this generational gap between farmer and urbanite now, and that's creating a serious disconnection, and I'm linking it to this theory. So the study, my entire PhD, essentially, the location is Tropical North State School. TNSS is located here in Gimoy, or Cairns. It's got a diverse socioeconomic background, and it's one of the largest primary schools in the region. So they cater to a very intense group of students, I would say. They have many different things. They have after school hours care. They have academic excellence programs. They have multiple sports excellence programs. And they also have the special needs centre. So I don't know, I think it's called that. And I feel really bad for calling it that. Anyway, they also have multiple gardens, and they have a Montessori stream of learning, which is an experiential type of, everyone knows like all the hippies sends their kids there, but it's a state school with a standard stream of learning, which is very textbook based. And then they've got a Montessori stream, which hands-on, and once a week they use maths, English, art, technology in a garden. So that's why this school posed to be a really good site to compare, which is my other paper, but I won't go into that today. I did semi-constructed interviews. So I had 29 questions. The interviews ranged from 40 minutes to an hour and a half long, depending how long people wanted to talk. I ended up with 536 codes across 15 interviews. I had parents, teachers, the school administrators, which includes one of the admin ladies and the school principal. I had the groundskeeper, which was really fun and interesting. It's a great perception from them. And then I had the school support workers, so school counsellors and a youth support worker. The coding was inductive and deductive. So deductive coding is knowing exactly what I'm looking for, seeing a specific word said. So as I'll show you on the next slide, poor motor skills. or motor skills, I would code that under motor skills. If it's inductive coding, it's much more subjective. And if someone says, oh, I don't know, the sky is really blue or really cloudy today and the children seem a bit disgruntled, I would maybe put that as children affected by weather, and that would be my code. So it's a little bit more open, which I guess people tend to not like so much, but I love it. You usually use that as a follow-up to your deductive coding. So, example of how this works. So motor skills, obviously the gross motor skill program mentioned in this quote from teacher 2 has been coded under blue. I've just done that for your ease of reading. Red, poor motor skills. So some children, you can see they've never really played on playgrounds, or they're scared to climb up the ladder and turn around and go back down backwards. I could have also coded that under fear. I could have coded that under not wanting to play. And then I've got no nature time. Children have been outdoors. That's supposed to be haven't. I should have copied and pasted that better. Children haven't been outdoors, not even in playgrounds. If they've been climbing trees, traditionally, they've got all that, gross motor skills, but they haven't. I've also coded that under motor skills built in nature. So that's just about how I code these interviews. It takes a really long time, and you sort of question yourself a lot, and you end up with like codes over codes, which all mean the same thing. But it's reaffirming when you realize you've coded the same thing 4 times under the same thing. So because I've now gone through my methods, in terms of EGA, I needed to first of all confirm that it was present in the schools. Like, if I'm going to investigate this, is it even worth investigating if the parents, the teachers and the participants, if they don't recognise it going on? So that was the first thing I looked for in my interviews. Asking them direct questions about it is potentially difficult because how do you ask someone about something that they might also be suffering from? So my questions were revolved around motor skills, nature contact time, the benefits of gardening, the barriers to it. They revolved around children's understanding of the tropical environment they're in, because I knew that they would sort of direct my participants to the place where we could have a conversation about it. So one participant noticed that some children, you can see, this is the same quote from just before. So basically, I had a PE teacher highlight to me that children don't have motor skills. Many other teachers pointed this out. Children that struggle to write generally lack the dexterity skills that gardening builds. So the teachers can tell they haven't used their, I don't know what the muscles are called for any physiology people. They haven't used these muscles growing up as much, so they lack the ability to write as well as other students. And then moral affiliation. Yeah, so vandalism and trying to ensure that people respect it, the gardens in this case, that they don't get in there and trash it out of hours or even in school hours, that people have respect for us. I think that would be the biggest barrier to gardens. Children, it's the schools trash gardens so much. Generally, they just run straight through if you don't pick up a fence. If you tell them to weed, a lot of them have problems understanding that not all things are weeds, so they rip out all of the plants as well. You have some kids just throwing tantrums and intentionally tipping over the compost buckets. You have other children going through and not just like digging up the plants, but then like tearing apart the worms and killing the bugs. It's quite awful. They just don't treat nature with respect. You also have them littering. They trash the school environment. Lots of litter, a lot of litter. And we all know that if you throw trash in the environment, you don't really care about it that much. Well, these days anyway. And then in terms of food disconnection, some children don't realise that milk comes from a cow or that farms produce food for us. There are a lot of quotes that were similar to this. They have a unit where they learn about milk and they have a large cow that comes in like a cardboard cutout, and the kids it blows their minds. They're like, what? My milk comes from that? And then they talk about almond milk and all of these other milks, and they just don't make the connection between what's in the package and what's the ingredient in the package. So that one was really profound for me though, because it just sort of said it plain and simple. And then they have poor place awareness. So this teacher, I was in their class semi around the time that this happened. So they don't realise that when you're looking at texts for kids for winter, that we won't get snow up here. So this is in a prep class. So they are only 5 or 4 at the time. But still, you would think growing up for 4 years in a tropical environment, you would know that there is no snow. If you come from a place where it does snow, maybe it confuses you that it doesn't snow here in winter, and it is generally okay weather. I'm not going to talk for this year though. But so I confirmed that it was there, and I was like, okay, well, all of these signs are sort of saying the 4 things that it manifests as, and the one that I want to hypothesize it manifests as, they're all appearing in the text. So that's really good for me and my research. Really sad for the kids though. I felt quite defeated. So the next thing was to look for the opportunities in the interviews to de-escalate this problem. So, building motor skills. There's raking, there's digging, there's turning, there's it's all pre-reading and pre-writing skills. This is what the Montessori teacher says. And then gardening builds gross and fine motor skills. Basically, you start to dig, you learn to work your muscles, you jump over the garden, you build walls. All of these things contribute to just having a better understanding of your body and what to do with it. Engendering moral affiliation with the natural environment. So the first quote is great, and I'll let you read that, but the second quote is the one I want to talk about. And a child who is an at-risk youth is what we refer to them in the school, basically was one of the worst at-risk youth and trashed everything all the time, was constantly getting sent to home for suspension or in school suspension, and was failing many classes. And the youth support worker basically decided that if this student, because the student loves gardening, they run a gardening program with the groundskeeper and they build things. And he became really passionate about composting. He just thought it was awesome. So the youth support worker was like, okay, if he can write a report, that's his science passed. If he can get up on parade and give a presentation, that's English passed. And he spoke to all the teachers and they were like, yep, this can happen. And so the kid got up on parade and gave a presentation about composting to all of his peers. And little delinquent friends, as I like to refer to them, got up behind him and they all stood there because they really love composting, learning about how to do it effectively and not being praised for doing something correctly. They really fell in love with it. And like, these guys are really protective of the space. They spray water at you if you come too close to the garden at lunch break. Their parents participate in it. So that's a really nice example of a student learning to love the environment by engaging with the environment and being given praise for doing so. Then we've got food origin awareness, my favourite. Gardening makes you aware of where food comes from. There's no other way to put it. Children that garden, they see a bean, they're like, I don't want to eat it, I don't like beans. And then they see someone else eating it and they don't want to be left out, so they eat it, which is really awesome. But they also learn to understand that nature exists with food. So the Montessori class, they bring it all in, and before they wash it, they go through the vegetables or like, you know, the lettuce and stuff to see if there's bugs in there. And yeah, so they have brought caterpillars in, they've brought little aphid mite things in. And instead of killing them, they just take it out and they put it back on the plant because they understand that it needs to be there. I really love that example because the kids just love worms. They love bugs now. I love it. And then we've got place connection. And place connection, so gardening makes things more real and purposeful. I don't know about any of you, but living here in the tropics, I'm not from the tropics, learning to garden up here was very difficult and I still really struggle at it. You can't grow tomatoes in winter. Down south, tomatoes grow quite well during the beginning of winter or the end of winter. Summer. You can't grow them in summer. You can only grow them in winter up here. And I really struggled with it. But the kids here, they learn what grows at school successfully during the seasons. They understand that, hey, rainy season is over. I need to start watering the garden. They understand that, okay, we've planted a bunch of corn and this actually doesn't like too much water right now, so we're going to put a little shelter up over it to stop it like dampening the roots too much. They understand that if they plant mint during the dry season, they have to plant it in a really wet environment because it likes wet feet. So they start to understand the seasons of their local place, which is amazing. It's such an attest to the power of gardening. They understand that the mango trees are flowering, but hey, the wind hasn't started or the wind hasn't come yet. So the wind's going to knock all the flowers off of the mango trees and we're going to have a bad season. They point out all of these things to you because they're becoming more aware of what's going on around them. And so going to interaction patterns, which if you remember, I spoke about that. That's how you de-escalate it correctly. So I was like, okay, it's cool, it's there. And then I've got all these things to say that gardening can address it. But what about interaction patterns? Because that's what Khan says definitively, de-escalates it. Poor motor skills, de-escalated by consistent raking, digging, weeding. You go out and you do things consistently with the garden and it builds motor skills. And then, you can pick up a coffee cup, you can write better. I'll go to another example soon of one of my observations, which I really loved. Limited moral affiliation, caring for non-humans. So not crushing the worms and the bugs, putting them back outside, having these repetitions so that when you go to the market or when you go to Woolworths and your parents see a bug in their vegetables, if it's survived, the kid won't just crush it straight away. Maybe they'll take it outside. Food origin disconnection, growing food and eating it, pretty plain and simple. if you grow food and you eat it, you realize that, hey, it tastes better from the ground. It does come from the ground. That's really surprising. I can't talk about meat, though. I don't know about how children feel about killing animals. That's not part of my study, so we're talking specifically about fresh fruit and veg. And then place disconnection. An interaction pattern there is experiencing the seasons, being outside during seasonal shifts. It does so much for children. So even if it's not gardening, being outside playing sport at all times of year. Here we play sport. I know that my supervisor's son plays soccer, I think, or something at lunchtime still. Like they still do a sport in the middle of the day at school. It doesn't work in the tropics during the hot seasons. The kids just come inside too frazzled. But if we move that to the afternoon, maybe that wouldn't happen. Anyway, that's just another side note of my distaste for how we run the education system. So personal reflections, gardening builds motor skills. Putting on gloves, you don't really do it up here in the tropics unless you're gardening. If you grow up in a temperate or a really cold environment, you stick gloves on every day. That's just what you do when you go to school. But when we run this gardening club, so that they don't get their uniforms dirty, we put gloves on the kids. And putting gloves on 30 kids just doesn't work. So we were like, okay, let's take a step back. Let's get them to put their own gloves on. And so getting them to do that, getting a preppy or a year one kid to put a glove on, they just don't understand it if they've never done it. They're like, where do I put my fingers? And then 4 fingers try to go into the same hole. It doesn't work. And so we do a pattern. You pick the glove out until you find one that matches your hand laying flat for the green side up. And so they go along, they do that, and then you spread your hand out and you put the glove on. And we have some children that have special learning needs that come in and they are like putting their gloves on in this pattern, and they're like, I did it. I put my gloves on. They generally walk off and don't garden, but they do put their gloves on and they put them on successfully, and they can do it every time now. And that's been about 2 terms of working with them for that. So that's just something that I love seeing there. Watching their dexterity improve and how they can separate their fingers. Oh my God, it's amazing. Gardening's enhancing moral affiliation. So this one specifically relates to worms. The little girls really, they have this thing, I think, because maybe it's just because they're girls. They're like, I'm supposed to be scared of worms. I don't know what it is. Anyway, I pick it up and I show them. I had one girl tear a worm once in half, and I was like, that's not on. It needs to be in the soil. We spoke about it. And now when they see a worm, they're like, oh my God, it's feeding our plants. Look at it. And then they put it back in nicely and they pat the dirt down. So that's really nice. And the girl that was responsible for tearing the worm loves them now. She's like, don't harm it. They get really passionate about it, actually. Gardens improving food awareness. Snake beans are really successful this year at the school. Because it's still raining, we are just getting crop upon crop upon crop of snake beans. I'm really over them, to be honest, in my own cooking. But students that wouldn't eat them at the beginning are now eating them every lunchtime, and they're eating them raw. At first they were like, no, do not like beans, don't come near me. My mother tries to feed me beans. And then one kid eats them, and then another kid eats them. And now they all come and they grab as many as they can, and you sort of have to be like, well, divvy it up, there's only 30 beans and there's 10 of you guys, one of you can't have all of the beans. So they divvy it up and they have that for their snack at lunch. So it's improving their understanding where food comes from, and it's making them enjoy this food, whether that's a competition, whether that's because they want to fit in, they're still eating the green beans. It's amazing. And then gardens enhancing place awareness. This one happened at the beginning of the year, and it's one of my favorite stories about understanding your place. There's a little girl there at the school, and she is like very dedicated to running the garden. She goes in, she gets all the gloves out for us every time that we run the club, and she waters it when it's throughout the week to make sure that it's, living. However, she's not watering it, or she wasn't watering it because it was raining, and she was like, oh, I don't need to water it. I'm just going to forget about that job. And then the rain stopped about March this year, maybe. It was like 2 or 3 weeks where I think we were all like, oh my God, dry season is hitting. Basically, we had sunflowers, we had some zucchinis, we had some other things. They just all died. And I was like, what are you doing? Like, Soph, what are you doing? The garden, it's dead. I thought you were watering it. And she was like, no, I wasn't, because it was raining all the time. And, I didn't start raining when the rain stopped, because I just thought they sort of keep on growing. And I was like, oh, no, that won't happen. They need to be watered every day, like while they're little baby seedlings, especially in this heat. And now Sophie is diligent when it comes to watering the garden. She's like, they're going to die again. I need to go make sure these little babies are living. I guess anyone that has a houseplant sort of knows that feeling. But I see that in her, and that's the first thing she does. She waters it. She makes sure it looks like rain and not just dumping it all on the one plant. And that's just enhancing her place awareness. When it rains, she holds off. When it stops raining, she's on top of it. And I really she's a really funny student. Anyway, that's it. Thank you. Gardens are great for de-escalating environmental generational amnesia. I'm done.